So now let's start for today's session, right? So this week there is no much theory part, right? So from theory perspective, we will only cover that gateway load balancer, right? As I said that while covering that classic load balancer, network load balancer, and the application load balancers, that we will cover that gateway load balancer later, right? The reason was that because that gateway load balancer is used for that third party devices, while that network load balancers, application load balancers, or the outdated classical load balancers, these load balancers we covered, these were used for that AWS services, right? When we have to manage the traffic on AWS services, right? For that AWS instances, for that we were using that load balancers. So now when I'm saying that we will cover that gateway load balancers, so that means we will cover and we will deploy any third party device, right? So as we discussed last week, right? So we will deploy a Palo Alto firewall on the cloud, right? So when I says that we will deploy a firewall, right? So I will cover two, three live scenarios that how generally organizations deploy the firewall and how generally they design the cloud environment with that firewall, right? So two or three times I will deploy that firewall, right, with the different scenarios. Just understand that. If you have any concerns, let me know, right? We will sort it out at same point. After that, because now I will say is that the basics part are completed. So now we will mostly work on the designing stuff, right? So we will, whenever we will deploy any services or whenever now we will put any security controls, right? So I will tell you that, okay, this is the designs and these things which we have already covered, right? So I will tell you that, and I will let you know that how to deploy that control, how to configure that. But for that backend designs, which we have already covered, you have to and do your hands dirty, right? So now let's discuss our first design, right? So in that first design, what we will do, we will create one VPC. Right? So that will be our basic design, right? So in that basic design, what we will do, we will create three availability zones, right? One availability zone for my public services or public resources, right? One I will create for my private services or private instances, right? And one availability zone I will create for my management, right? Then what we will do, as we know that to connect to any of the VPC, to connect to any of the VPC, what we do, we create one internet gateway, right? And that internet gateway connects to internet, and through that we are accessing. So in our first design, what we will do, we will create one Palo Alto, right? So we will deploy that Palo Alto. That Palo Alto we will deploy in management availability zone, right? Because whenever we have to access any of the network device or any of the security device, right? So we configure one management link, through that we are accessing that, right? So we will deploy one Palo Alto in management availability zone, right? So this will be our firewall. So one NIC I will by default, whenever we deploy, right, there is a one network interface, right? So that is connected with the management interface, management availability zone. So as I have to connect to that private availability zone with that firewall, I have to connect public availability zone with that firewall. So as you know that we can create a elastic network interfaces, right? So one elastic network interface I will create and connect with that public availability zone. One elastic network interface I will create for a private availability zone and connect with that Palo Alto, right? Then we will do a routing, right? So how it will go to that internet gateway, whether it will go through that management interface or whether it will go through that public interface, right? So that we will design. So generally, we will allow the connectivity over the internet for my public ENI and for management one. Management one we will use to access our Palo Alto firewall, right? So that will be used for our control plane accesses, right? For our firewall patches, updates, for upgrades, right? We will use this management interfaces, right? However, for my dynamic net, whenever my database or my any EC2 instance has to access to the internet services through that Palo Alto firewall, right? Then it will send request to private ENI to Palo Alto. Then it will check the policies. After policies, it will check that NAT, and after NAT, that through that routing, it will go through that public ENI to my IGW, right? So this will be our first design, right? Then in that second design, we will create a little bit complex thing. Like with that same design, we have one Palo Alto, right? And we will create Palo Alto in failover, right? So we have a two separate Palo Altos in two different instances, right? I have created a public ENI for here, one private ENI for here, right? So in case of this EC2 instance down, right, or this Palo Alto goes down, so how AWS will automatically switch my network and virtual network interfaces, my elastic network interfaces from this instance to this instance, right? So we will cover this, right? That how my elastic network interfaces, which I have manually configured, right? Because when we will launch Palo Alto, there will be only one NIC that is for a management NIC, right? So how my public network interface and the private network interface, not on the Palo Alto level, that we are creating on the AWS level. So how that AWS actually switch that network interfaces from my primary to secondary one, right? This one. So these two practicals we will cover today, right? So tomorrow we will create one complex design, right? So that design generally organizations deploy in their each region. So when I'm saying that from organizations perspective, so what we will create one security VPC, right? Here I will have all my firewalls, right? My DLP solutions, my proxy, web proxy services, right? So whatever the antiviruses or whatever the security solutions I have, we will deploy that in security VPC. Then we will connect this VPC with my production VPC. We have production DC, whatever you said. Here I will have all my project servers, right? Like my domain controllers, my coding servers, where we deploy all our source codes or whatever the production applications they are running, right? So what if, let's suppose I have 18 projects in my US region which are running, right? Or the 18 project teams which are working on the cloud. So all their 18 servers will be in my cloud production data center, right? DC. Or then I will create one more VPC. That VPC is for my front end APIs or applications. Like if this is my on-prem environment, right? So all the users are connecting to this VPC where I have a servers, or I will say is that this is my client VPC or a non-prod VPC, whatever you want to say, right? So we will create one more VPC here. Then this VPC and this VPC will be interconnect with that TGW, right? Or if we can create one more VPC, that all three will be connect to that TGW to for internal connectivity, they will communicate through that TGW, but whenever they have to send a request to the internet, right? Or if somebody has to access that request from internet to these services, then we will deploy one firewall here. So they all will send that request to that firewall, right? Through that firewall, it will process that inbound and outbound traffic for that VPCs, right? And last design which we will cover, that will be a little bit new for us, because in that third design we already know that what is TGW, what is attachments, but still we will cover that. And in the last design we will cover gateway load balancer. In that gateway load balancer, we will deploy one firewall behind that gateway load balancers, right? So that in case if I have to deploy one firewall in one availability zone, one firewall in one availability zone to manage a HA, right? Or if we have to deploy firewalls in active, right? Then how that gateway load balancer will manage that traffic, right? So these four designs we will cover in these two classes. So now what I will do, I will create one VPC. That is very basic design, right? So this is for actually just a basic deployment of firewall, so that you guys can understand that how we deploy that, understand the basic steps. So most of the concepts we already know, right? What is VPC, what is subnet, what is ENI, what is associates, subnet associates. There will be a few new features, right, that I will tell you that we are using while deploying any third party tool, right? So this is my security VPC. This is my security VPC. So here I will create 3 subnets. This will be my private subnet. That private subnet will be, that will be my private subnet. This will be my management subnet, and this will be my public subnet, right? So let's say we will use a management IP 10.0.0.0/24, right? And for my public, I will use 10.0.1.0/24. And for private one, I will use 10.0.2.0/24, right? And this my security VPC is a subnet of 10.0.0.0/16. As you know that the we can use that subnet from /16 to /28, right? So I am using that security VPC for that. This will be my management subnet, this will be my private subnet, this will be my public subnet, right? Then we will deploy one firewall in a management interface. Then again we will jump to this design, right? So right now in my first step, what I am going to do, I am going to create one VPC, then I am going to create these 3 availability zones, right? So now let's jump. Right. Guys, in between, if you have any concerns, right? So just raise that same point, right? I am going to create VPC, security VPC. And the network I am going to assign is 10.0.0.0/16. I will go with that default, will not go with that dedicated one. Right. My security VPC is created. Let's do one thing. VPC name, security VPC, subnets, what I am going to use, management one, I am using 10.0.0.0/24. Public one, I will use 10.0.1.0/24. And private one, I will use 10.0.2.0/24.